Today I want to talk with Dr. Jen Frahm, founder of Conversations of Change and the Agile Change Leadership Institute, a world-leading organizational change expert. And I'm hoping to talk today about some insights around moving to WordPress and the concept of replatforming or data migrations for publishers and businesses more broadly, and what that looks like, not from just a technical aspect, but how businesses can make the change to a different technology platform or different technology stack more seamless and less painful. Over the years at the Code Company, we've done many number of different replatforming projects in different shapes and sizes for businesses of different shapes and sizes. And often the human aspect of these migrations are some of the most complicated parts of this, changing business processes or internal processes. So Jen, thank you for joining today, and hopefully we can share some insights today on change management and how we sort of can do better in replatforming projects, both external agencies like ourselves and internal teams that we work with.
Absolutely, look forward to chatting with you.
So, I mean, something that has been new to me, well, not new to me, but I guess the actual concept of change management. So you and I have known each other for years and years now. And for quite a long time, I probably haven't really understood what you do, which I know a lot of people would often say that about me. They don't know. They just, a weird phenomenon. But more recently, as we've sort of worked on different projects, the concept of change management, and I think more broadly in a business community, it's becoming more of a common phrase, and the adoption is maybe picking up. So I guess at a high level, how do you describe change management to somebody that's never heard of it? And I guess, is there a difference between organizational change management and change management, which are two, I don't know if they're the same thing, but two terms I hear a lot of?
Yeah, great questions to kick off with, Ben. So I guess, how do I describe change management? So change management for me is the intentional design of a change to a business. And that is everything from how do we design the change, how do we build the change, how do we implement the change in a way that we get the business outcomes that we want to achieve. So you mentioned before, is there a difference between change management and organizational change management? And there is. So typically, when we use the term change management, we're often referring to very discrete pieces of change. So perhaps project changes. So the example you provided before in terms of replatforming is a discrete project change, which you would use change management as a process, right? So there are various methodologies and tools, and that's the type of place where you would come in and use change management to get the outcomes of the replatforming. Now, the challenge for a lot of projects is that they often occur in context of broader organizational change. And so when we speak organizational change management, we're often thinking about a much bigger platform of change, which might be strategic change, it could be cultural change. And so your technical change is one component of that broader organizational change.
And that's something, I guess, that is often hard to think about so early on, because a lot of prospects or people we'll work with will be so excited by the technology change and the hands-on, what can I see and change, and that for a lot of cases is moving off, say, an old content management system or something that's been built internally. So the thought of being able to use WordPress in our case and be able to publish content quicker or manage their homepage or send newsletters faster or work on page performance and see the SEO benefits and things like that can often be so appealing that it's very easy to forget about taking the rest of the business on that change. And that's where replatforming projects can, I guess, come unstuck. And that's something we're trying to have better discussions with clients and prospects about, is how do we make sure that the rest of the business is coming along and kind of avoiding that tail wagging the dog situation of a very small part of the business wanting to do a change from a technology perspective that has impacts throughout the entire business.
Yeah, it's a really good insight, Ben. And I think often Often the people who are either the vendors like yourselves or the people who have ownership of the budget and have made the decision that they want to do the change can be quite evangelistic with the change, right? Because you're the ones closest to the power of what it can actually do. But there can often be quite a big chasm between the evangelist and the rest of the business. And if we think about the question you asked prior, the difference between organizational change and change management, if the people that you need to bring along the journey on your particular technology platform are also undergoing change in multiple other areas, they can be quite overwhelmed with what's happening and just not see the benefits that you see for the sake of sheer overwhelm of change in the organization.
So often when we start on a replatforming project, there's often going to be a lot of stakeholders, kind of implicit and explicit. So people who are directly making decisions about a design or a menu item or a content structure, or what are the categories on a homepage going to look like. How do you broaden that net to work from a business perspective? And this is something often as a vendor, as a third-party agency, we don't have the privy or that information, but it helps make our projects go more smoothly if a business can go through this process. So how is a good way to work out those key stakeholders and also, I guess, weighing that up with businesses that are obviously really busy and on short on resources, and there's always a lot of things going on, which is often the case in publishing. Things move very quickly.
Yeah.
How do you find the right amount of balance of having enough stakeholders to capture things like that?
That's a really tough thing to do, and from my perspective, there's this real clear algorithm, if you like, around effort and benefit. The more effort you put up front in analysis, in understanding your context and who's who in the zoo and who's going to be impacted, the better your outcomes will be. If you skimp on that up front, then you're going to be doing reworks, you're going to be doing remediation, all that kind of stuff further down the process, when effectively the change that you put into play becomes a live impact analysis. All of a sudden you switch everything on and go, oh, I didn't realize that it did this. I didn't realize that you did that. So back
Right.
to your question, back to your question about how do you know who are the right people to contact. This is the power of having somebody in the organization. And so I'm thinking about your client organization who's really savvy around connecting with people. Companies that have a high use of things like enterprise social networks, so Yammer or Workplace, things like that, and are used to living their work transparently, have a much better chance of having critical stakeholders identified. So I think, really good change managers, if your company has a change manager in there, or it doesn't have to be a change manager, but someone who does that work is really good at lifting up rocks and looking at, well, if we do this, who gets impacted? Who actually does that? And ask those really clever questions. Well, I say clever questions, they're actually often really simple questions that we forget to ask.
The less obvious ones. Yeah.
Yeah. But they need to be asked to understand who are the people who contribute to each of the functions that you're doing or are dependent on the outcome of those functions. And so, I often say that as long as it's going to take you to do the build, you probably want to do as much on the analysis to understand context, stakeholders, impacts.
Because I guess thinking about it in tangible examples from our work and working in publishing and replatforming, there's such a different spectrum of people. So something that happens very often is the amount of ad tech that's running on a website, and what often happens is it's incrementally added, and over time, especially at the point of a replatforming, it's a bit of a cleaning house, and realize, we're running 52 ad slots on a website. That's crazy. So, I think from that perspective, in terms of to change that, there are technical decisions that have to make, and that's something that we can obviously assist with. But there's design. So how does that fit in with the new design? So someone has to sign off on design side of things. There's commercial impacts, because how much which ad slots are generating the most revenue, which ones are underperforming, what the clients want. What do we do if we have one client that wants to spend a lot of money and they're the only one who wants that particular ad slot? How do we decide those things? And then ad traffickers, so people who have to actually load the ads and assign them, and then the editorial team, because they now need to also, are there any changes to their day-to-day in terms of tagging content differently or setting ad templates up differently when they're producing an article in the back end? So it's really, how do you make sure that that whole team is across this? And like you said, the less time you put into it at the beginning, you end up sort of figuring it out by just closing your eyes and sort of touching the wall and hang on, that was wrong, or we didn't think that would work, or worse, it goes live and realizing no one set the ads up for this one client that pays us a lot of money for this one unique thing that everyone just assumed was not used anymore.
Yeah. And I think there's actually a real opportunity, Ben, right at the beginning of that process, because whenever we bring in new technology platforms and solutions, it inevitably is an opportunity to streamline processes, right? So it's a pretty safe bet that any new technology we bring in is better than what we had before, which means
why we're doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So with that, we can streamline our business processes with that. If you do a piece of work right up front, which employs, principles of design thinking to understand what is the problem we're trying to solve here,
Mm-hmm.
it gives you a more holistic view of saying, well, yes, the technology component is one aspect of it. Perhaps there's a behavioral piece and perhaps there's a process piece. And how can we make them work together so that we have this really beautiful experience at the end of it, rather than going, great technology, but gee, behaviors have got to change to make this work.
Yeah, because the extreme of that is you can't just switch over a business overnight, and the editorial team or the people who use it on the inside of the business aren't across those changes or very minimal, or they're sort of brought in right at the end and said, here's the new thing, learn how to use it. It's changes next week. So looking at different sizes of businesses and people's resources and internal skill set, because that obviously varies a lot. How is a good way to sort of think about how much assistance you need? Because I know in really big enterprise organizations, the concept of dedicated external change management is something you've done a lot of in the past. And I guess that sort of filters back as the smaller the business gets to that sort of smaller organization where, let's just say it's 5 to 10 people. There's still a change management process that has to happen. There's still a coordination, and it's not something that just one person can brief an external agency, go build something, go change something, and then roll it back. So how do we think about the various levels? Like if I'm the person who's leading a project internally in a 10-person business, I know I don't need a full-time change manager to come internally. Is it embracing change thinking along with agile development, which obviously works very well, and they're very complementary. So going back to that, if I'm thinking more from an agile and change management perspective and sort of the various levels as the size of the project and the business complexity, because they're both very related and levers to pull here.
Okay. So you've just called out two variables there, as in size of the business and size of the complexity. They're not the variables we're worried about. We're worried about the cost of achieving the benefits of doing this versus the cost of it going wrong. So if through implementing, whether you have 100 people or 1,000 people, if the cost of implementing your solution and getting it wrong is not particularly high or critical to the business, so reputation, customer, those kind of things, then I'm going to say that you probably don't need to invest in external change management support. If the cost to your business through either reputation or business benefits in terms of what you think that you're going to achieve is significant, then you want to look at part of that budget being dedicated to change management expertise. Mm-hmm. So that's where you've got to start, not how many people you have or how complex it is. It's actually, what have you got to lose?
Right.
It's
It's a
a
good way to think about it.
Yeah, look, change management, and it's a pragmatic way, right? Because you don't want to overcook something. You know, change management isn't a relatively high priced expertise. There is value in those people who come in and make things work for you. So you've got to actually look at that expense to say, well, where does this fit in relation to the cost of stuffing this up?
Yep.
And therefore, is it a good risk mitigation?
Right.
So for me, change management is risk mitigation in
Risk
this
mitigation.
context. Yeah.
So thinking about risk mitigation, something that's talked about a little bit is in a replatforming project. I guess if you go to the crux of what that means, it is picking something up and just switching platforms. So essentially maintaining functionality and and things like that. There's always the appetite during a replatforming project to bake in a redesign.
Yeah.
So even thinking about a small business website of your own, to simply switch from Squarespace to WordPress, or you think about the Washington Post, switching from their system to another system is by definition a replatforming. Parts of that will include data migration and rebuilding certain things, but how do you think in terms of risk mitigation around not embracing or embarking on a redesign as well as a replatforming? So I guess the concept is you sort of recreate what's there now and not engage in
Yeah.
that part of the project, just get the base built and then go through redesigns.
Mm. I guess the answer on that depends on how flexible the platform is that if we're just doing an installation of
Hmm.
technology, then the question that I'd be interested in then is how flexible is that
Yeah.
down the track, right? But you're right. If we're doing a replatforming of any nature, and this is the opportunity to rethink what is the business problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And does it serve us? Does it make sense that we do a redesign at the same time or just prior to better support the benefits from this technology? And so, like, I'm not so sure about how it works in your space, but when we work in anything that's SaaS based
Mhm.
as systems implementation, and so you usually have very little flexibility in how you customize that for clients, right? It's off the shelf in a box. Now, that means you must do your redesign before you're going to get success with that technical product,
Yep.
right? Because you've got to, in some cases, you might have, 100 different processes running for different parts of the businesses that you've got to harmonize into one process to fit into that SaaS platform.
Yeah, I guess as another non-publishing way of thinking about it would be if you were migrating, and I listened to a few podcasts with people talking about this kind of stuff. It would be moving from a legacy payroll system to a
Mhm.
cloud-based system, but
Yep.
the actual business reason is they want to switch from monthly pay to weekly pay. Do you switch the cloud accounting platform first and
Yep.
then as the second process then switch the payroll? It's I guess a risk mitigation process, and let's get one change done first which has a whole bunch of processes that doesn't actually benefit the actual long-term goal that we're trying to work towards, and then
Yep.
the second goal is then flicking the switch on the fortnightly to monthly or to weekly, whatever that is, but changing that as a second piece rather than it all go wrong at the same time.
Totally, because your first piece then becomes a proof of concept,
Mhm.
right? We can actually do this.
Yep. And
You
that's
know,
often, I guess, how you think about a replatforming is let's get off this legacy system. Let's get to WordPress. We don't need to think about too much down the line in terms of we can have ideas about feature development, but the idea of using WordPress as a content management platform is that it will increase agility and experimentation and all these other things, but we don't want to bake all of that in. Otherwise, we run the risk of a project that never ends
exactly.
because the goalposts aren't really defined on some of those less tangible
Yeah.
items.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the benefit, how a change manager would look at that kind of challenge is thinking about what is it that we actually need to serve the people who use this or your customers. And because often you've got decisions to make about what's nice to have versus what's necessary.
Mhm.
And change management is often very good at understanding how people use things and the behavioral use to go, actually, this is necessary. It's not just nice to have. So, that's where that lens comes in really useful in thinking that through.
So, what do you say to people who, I guess, are starting out on a project now, that they're thinking they've got a technology reason they're wanting to replatform in the next 6 to 12 months? The current system either is costly or it doesn't work, or it's, there's some business reasons behind that. How do you think about that before you engage a technical partner to assist with some of that? They may have, we may be brought in to supplement existing teams or to do most of that work in terms of the technical replatforming.
Yeah.
But how would you, I guess, if your advice to someone who's owning this project, like the sponsor of this project, to think about what's the best next step for them in terms of making it a successful replatforming project beyond
Yeah.
the technology?
Yeah. Look, I think consult often, consult early, right? So you have so much wisdom in your organization. And often sponsors think that expertise is, up in this higher levels of the organization. But if you actually go out to all of the organization and say, look, this is our intent this year, this is why we think this is a good thing to do, please come forward, tell us your stories, good or bad, around what this is about. And you might find that the scope of the RFP is very different because you've had some real gems have been brought forward by your workforce. So I'm a big fan of transparency. I'm a big fan of having a very large, expansive consultation process because, it actually can save you money in the long run.
It's better
Because
to
you've
lean
got
into that early than after the fact, because they're the people who will have these things that will boil up after it's too late and the window
totally
has now
Ben.
closed. Yeah.
And this is the other secret of change management. When you involve your people in co-creating your solution, and so that means co-creating the RFP, it's very hard to push back on what comes out of it if you had a part in creating it,
Yeah.
right? So you reduce change resistance down the track by bringing them in and giving them a sense of ownership really early.
Great. I guess my final question for today, I guess, is in terms of the tangible replatforming, so tools and products and things changing for your internal organization. So, if you're an ad trafficker who has to set ads to run with articles or categories of content, or you're a journalist who writes content, how's the best way to think about, or what are the key things to think about in terms of their life changing through the process? So obviously you might have this project that might run for 6 months. So you don't want to bring them in too early to that project and sort of preempt the training or the retraining on tools and those sort of specifics. But also you don't want to sort of leave it to the last minute. Is it really just a thing of communication and sort of internal management of really just talking these things through and what's happening so people are aware, rather than that top down, here is the proclamation of everything that changes next week, you've got 1 week to adjust? Or
Yeah. Look, I think so. There's a curve that we talk about in change called the change commitment curve from Darrell Connor's work, and it starts off with the first stage of the curve. Where if we think about taking people on the journey, bit cliched, but we'll use it. We take them through the phase of awareness first. Once they're aware, you can move them to understanding. Why is it that we're doing it? Understanding what does the impacts mean for them, understanding how they use it. Once they understand, they move to buy-in. So they'll actually use the system, right? So if we think about that as a model of what does change management look like, or introducing this over time, it's about looking at the milestones of your project. So to your point, if it's going to take a 6-month build, starting with awareness and coming back to people on a regular basis just to give them status updates to say, look, in February, we told you this is what we're going to do. It's now March. Here's where we're at. Nothing particularly exciting happening for you, but we're all systems go. Now, the reason why that's important is that if you don't come back to them with interim updates, they will create stories to fill the void. And those stories will not be helpful to you, right? So
counterproductive.
that's it. Our brains crave certainty. And so part of that certainty is you give regular updates of how the program or the project is going.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today. I know you've got a few different courses and training. Where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more about change management and fascinating world that it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you saw this. And I think LinkedIn's probably the easiest place to find me. Other than that, it's drjenfrahm.com or the Agile Change Leadership Institute.com.au.
Thanks for your time, Jen.
Or Twitter.
Or
You can get
Twitter,
me
of
on Twitter.
course. Absolutely. Thanks for your time today, Jen.
Thanks, Ben.